Welcome back to the history of early Western civilization. This is Professor Allen, and finally, here is Lecture Day 19. I know we've had a little bit of a delay due to last week, but here it is, finally. And so it's going to be quite a long lecture, but I think a lot of it is very interesting, some really fun, kind of interesting, crazy stories, as well as some maybe funny ones or depending on your humor. I like to kind of call this lecture the Sex, Drugs, and Rock and Roll lecture of the Roman Empire. Some of the part of the sex, drugs, and rock and roll part is kind of puns rather than actual, but you'll get to see that as we go. So let's go ahead and get started with this lecture. And so where we left off last time was when Octavian, okay, who was 33 years old at the time because he was born in 63 BCE, returns to Rome after being victorious in Egypt after defeating Marcus Antonius and Cleopatra. And of course, Marcus Antonius and Cleopatra both killed themselves rather than be captured by him. And so Octavian, right here, as well as his co-consul and, kind of military master, Marcus Agrippa, were both victorious, but Octavian, of course, being the leader, is the one that takes the credit. And so he returns to Rome at 33 years old and is basically now the sole ruler of Rome, without necessarily it being said that he's the sole ruler of Rome, okay? And so at this point, the Senate kind of realizes he's in charge and really powerful, so they make him a new title called Princeps Senatus, or Senatus, and which means first senator, okay? And we talked about that last time. He eventually kind of shortens that to just Princeps, okay? And so it's really the title Princeps, which means first citizen. Okay, so he's no longer first senator, but now first citizen, as in kind of not just not because he's first, but because he's the best or the most important, whatever you want to call it. And so Rome at this time becomes known as the Principate. It's still the Republic at this time, although, kind of questionable on how much of a republic it is. But it becomes known as the Principate at this period, around 30 BCE. He's given consular power, and of course he constantly runs for re-election and just always wins. And then Marcus Agrippa typically also is his co-consul, also running for power. Then he swaps Marcus Agrippa out for different, advisors at times. But he kind of rewards Marcus Agrippa, his long-term friend and general that's always won the battles for him, is Marcus Agrippa. So he always has him at his side. He eventually decides to establish a personal bodyguard that is a bit more loyal and more powerful than the standard bodyguard that the Roman consuls and Roman rulers had had before in the past. And he basically makes this a pseudo-military regiment called the Praetorian Guard, where they're all usually 6 feet tall or taller, if possible, not just chosen for their military ability but also their looks, because he wants them to look very typically Roman and typically very powerful and intimidating, as well as kind of handsome looking, so that they can be in the Senate with him and stuff like that, and official functions and stuff, and look like the part of importance. And so that's the Praetorian Guard. And they were basically very much the legionnaires, but with slightly different uniforms, kind of more regal looking, usually with purple and stuff, as opposed to just the red or something like that for the cloaks and togas that they would wear under their armor. He also starts developing a secret police force and starts having informants, which are basically wrapped up into the secret police, to start quelling political uprisings, and anyone that really speaks out against him, he kind of removes and has killed, or at least put in jail. And in fact, he kills more senators and equestrians, the people that are under the patricians. Remember, the senators are the patricians, but then the equestrians were that next class of people that were very wealthy and powerful. Well, many of the equestrian class also kind of spoke out against him during this period, as well as some senators that didn't like him. And so he actually kills more senators and equestrians than all of his successors will do in the next 200 years. And there's going to be a lot of the following in the next 200 years that kill a ton of people under them that they don't like. But he kills an incredible amount of enemies, political enemies, during this period of time. And it's just kind of not thought about by a lot of time, because a lot of time under his power and his rule is very peaceful, but it's because he kind of covered it up and kept it quiet when he was killing people. Okay? And so they would just kind of be whisked away in the middle of the night and never seen again. So yeah, kind of scary at the time, right? And so in 27 BCE, after 3 years of being the princeps, or princeps senatus, whichever one you want to go with, mostly the princeps because he changed from the other one, he basically tells the Senate that he's going to retire and give up all of his power and just kind of live his life. And he's only 36. And it's really apparent that this was a ploy. Okay, this is flat out a ploy for more power. Okay, that he's telling the Senate that he's going to give up everything because at this point they're kind of relying on him, and the only members of the Senate left during this period are going to be ones that are very loyal to him and like him a lot. Okay, and so when he tells them that he's going to retire, they're like, no, please don't do that. And he's like, no, I've made up my mind. And then he goes home. And then they invite him back from his villa, and he, addresses the Senate the next day or a few days later and does the same thing. And they're like, no, we'll give you more power. And he's like, really? No, I don't want that. No. And then he says, no, I'm going to retire. And again, it's still a ploy. He's kind of wanting them to keep on seeing how much they'll give him in power. And then finally, 3 or 4 times after doing this, they finally basically say, we'll give you complete power for the rest of your life. And basically make him dictator without saying dictator. And so he's got this imperial power for the rest of his life, and he is persuaded to remain. And he feels like, oh, yes, fine, you've persuaded me to remain and, kind of still lead. But really, it was a ploy the whole time. It was his own way to do it. And that was because, again, he had put in people into the Senate that were only loyal to him. And those that kind of teetered on the edge of being, not liking him and, liking him, the middle ground people, they kind of were like, okay, well, we're kind of the minority right now, so let's just give him more power. And so eventually the Senate kind of gives him full power, and over time he eventually is given power at this time as Imperator Augustus. Okay? And he will forever be now known as Augustus, not as Octavian. So he changes his name, and just becomes known as Augustus. Okay? But Imperator basically means emperor, and Augustus kind of eventually means emperor as well. But for the most part, just remember that his name is now no longer Octavian, it is now Augustus. So from now on, anytime I say Augustus, it is the same person that we talked about all of last lecture against Mark Antony Octavian, right? Okay? And he's going to constantly rule as consul and kind of share power with Marcus Agrippa, but Marcus Agrippa is really under him. Just make sure that it's completely understood that even though he kind of is like sometimes as consul every single year, and Marcus Agrippa sometimes gets to be consul as well, really Augustus / Octavian is the one ruling, and everybody else under him is just kind of ruling under him at that point. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about some of his... and also, by the way, we are no longer as a republic. Once in 27 BCE, when he becomes Imperator Augustus, or emperor, it is no longer a republic. It is now an empire. It is the Roman Empire. It has changed. And remember, in 753 BCE, under Romulus, it was a kingdom. And then eventually that changed to a republic when they forced the last king out. And then finally now we've changed back to kind of a monarchy, kind of, but it's not a king or rex, because Rome hates those words. It is now emperor or imperator. okay, if in Latin. Okay, so now we are an imperial government, not now no longer a republic. And he enacts many of reforms, and of course we've already talked about this, where he cleaned up the city of Rome. With he liked to say that he found the Rome a city of bricks and left it a city of marble. It was really travertino or limestone, covering everything that looked like marble. He limited the size of the buildings to 6 stories, and then he also divided the city of Rome into 14 little districts, and includingly, while doing that, also created a fire brigade, an actual fire department, and a police force. Beforehand, they really didn't have that. The Praetorian Guard kind of acts as that police force a lot of times, but he does create a real police force as well. Okay? And so, first the Praetorian Guard is very small. Eventually it becomes very large, and we'll talk about that later on. And so the fire brigade is finally the first real fire brigade in Roman history in the city of Rome, because the first previous one was under Crassus. And it was kind of a private-owned one, right, for his real estate things. And so that was ages ago. And they'd had kind of like private ones before and since, but nothing as big as what Crassus did. And now Augustus, or Octavian, remember, he was Octavian, now he's going by Augustus, changes it, and he makes a full-on fire brigade, okay, fire department. Moving on. He also makes multiple other reforms and changes, so let's continue on with that. So, family reforms. Let's talk about those first. He wanted to increase the Roman population at this point, and because of that, he needs to increase birth rates, okay? And so what he decides to do is he thinks about how to make that work politically, and how you can encourage more babies. And so what he does is he creates tax breaks, as in tax cuts, for large families. If you've got a family of a certain size, okay, if it's small, you have to pay more taxes than possibly a family with more people and having more children in it. He also bans abortion. That abortion had been around since basically the Sumerians, or at least the Egyptians. A safe abortion method, well, somewhat safe. And so he gets rid of that. He no longer wants abortion to be legal. Okay, and he bans it through imperial decree. He also changes some things along the lines for letting men and women file for divorce. Men already could file for divorce at this time, okay, but he now allows it so that women could file for divorce because he wants them to be, you know, married into a relationship that's going to have children, right? And if they're not very happy in the relationship they're in, that might not be happening with this population part. And so what he ends up doing is he allows women to now file for divorce, okay? Kind of cutting edge at the time, right? But if a woman did so, they had to make sure to remarry within 2 years, or they're going to be fined or face some kind of legal consequences if they didn't get remarried within 2 years of filing for divorce themselves. And so that's kind of, again, mixing with this population and birth rates thing, where he wants people to start having babies, okay, and Roman citizens throughout not just Italy, but throughout the whole Roman Empire at this point, okay. He also allows men were able to visit prostitutes, okay. They could legally visit prostitutes and have a prostitute that they would pay for sex, but they were no longer allowed to have mistresses, meaning affairs, okay, actual affairs for love or anything like that. So you could visit a prostitute if you were a man, but no longer have an affair. And again, that was because he wanted to increase the population and birth rates. And he believed that men spent their energy with concubines or mistresses and prostitutes and then had nothing left for their wives, which caused population to decline. A little weird of an idea there, but maybe. Maybe, depending on how you want to look at it. So, we'll leave it at that part. Moving on, let's talk a little bit about some of his other reforms. Governmental reforms, meaning, okay? Let's first start with that. And so, at this point, the bureaucracy and civil service, meaning the government of the imperial government, okay, of the empire, kind of was kept the same as what it previously was. They're going to still have consuls. He's always going to be one of them. And the emperor from then on would always be one of the 2 consuls. Okay, sometimes they would have another person underneath, the 2 consuls underneath, but for the most part, the one of the emperor was usually one of the consuls, okay? And then they would kind of pick another person or have the other person be elected, but they would always make sure it was one of their allies elected. And if it wasn't, sorry, you lost the election. Kind of thing. He also had the tribunes for the plebs, the praetors, which are under the consuls, censors to do the censorship, not censorship, but to do the censor for the government to see how many people there were, right? Okay, and stuff like that. All done during this time were basically the same as they were beforehand. Okay, they were all doing the same job as before during the Republic, but no longer was it just based on who you knew to get into many of those spots like it was under the Republic. It was now definitely always based on talent and merit, and not hereditary, okay? Talent and merit and not hereditary, meaning that you couldn't just be born into a family and then go, oh, well, my family's always been in this position, so I'll be it eventually too. No, that wasn't going to happen. He wanted to make sure the right man for the right job. In some of those positions, he would kind of make sure to have a say, as well as some of the future emperors would do the same thing. But for the most part, they would only pick people that were qualified for those jobs, okay? Most, if not always. And they'd find someone else that was otherwise. They also had a lot of provincial administration changes, meaning all the different provinces. A lot of the times when a governor was in charge of a province, they would just kind of tax the people there in that province themselves an extra private tax, and that would mean hardship on the people in that province, or the governor would do something else corrupt somehow. And so Augustus realized the way to stop that corruption is just give a little bit of money to the governors to make sure that they aren't doing that. And so he basically bribed the governors to stop them from being corrupt. Kind of a corrupt way to stop them from being more corrupt, but it worked, into a point, at least. And he basically also ensured that the governors were going to be loyal to him. And so that's really important as well. Loyalty. He also increased the taxes. He realized that we needed to change a couple things with the taxes by having the census, which are handled by the censors, and that the census would create fair taxes on people based on how much money they were able to produce each year from their jobs. He also created two new taxes, a poll tax, meaning a tax that was required if you wanted to go vote, which in America is illegal. But in ancient Rome, it was not. And so if you could not pay to be able to go vote, you were not allowed to vote if you couldn't pay this tax in ancient Rome. And then he also had a land tax. They finally made a new tax on land in the empire because there was just so big of an empire, they decided to start taxing the people that lived on their land a certain amount, a little bit more than they previously had, and changed it a little bit. He also passes a bunch of new laws to improve conditions across the entire empire. Okay, and so too many to really name, but lots of things to do with building new roads or repairing roads, making sure aqueducts were being built and stuff like that, or being upkept and stuff like that as well. Okay, so major little minor rules and law changes across the entire empire during this time. And during all of this, during this period, under Augustus, we have something ushered in called the Pax Romana, or the Pax Romana, depending on how you want to pronounce the word there. And so this means the Roman peace, okay? The Roman peace. The Pax Romana directly translates to Roman peace, okay? It begins under Augustus, okay, as him being emperor. And you could kind of argue that it kind of really began when he was still Octavian in 27 BCE, or 30 BCE even if you really wanted to, when Mark Antony and Cleopatra were done with, but definitely when he became emperor, okay, in 27 is what we're going to go with. 27 BCE for the real number. And it lasts until the year 192 CE. Okay, we're counting forwards at that point, okay? So BCE, before current era, and into current era. So 200 years, more than 200 years, this Roman peace lasts. And what's that Roman peace mean? Well, it's going to be peace throughout everything owned by the Empire. There's going to be pretty much peaceful conditions. There's going to be a couple minor things, okay? Couple minor issues that are not so peaceful, and we'll talk about those today in this lecture. But for the most part, most of it is very peaceful. They're not going to have war with any big nations during this period of time either. They're going to kind of have peace for most part, except for one major exception. So let's talk about that major exception right here. The Battle of Teutoburg Wald in September of the year 9 CE, 9 current era, okay? We don't know the exact date, we just know it was roughly September, probably, okay? Or September and in the year 9, okay, the 9 CE. So, 2011 years ago, because this year's 2020, right? So, year 9, okay? Not BCE, CE. And it was fought in Germany in the Teutoburg Wald. Okay, the Teutoburg Wald was, the Wald means forest, Teutoburg Forest, okay? And what happened was Publius Quinctilius Varus was the Roman commander, and he was in charge of the legions of the 17th, 18th, and 19th legions. 3 legions, roughly 15,000 men, okay? And he was marching through the forest that day, being led by a scout, a former tribal leader of Germans, okay, named Arminius. Arminius was this Roman, or this German working for the Romans, okay? And he was a tribal leader, and he had kind of set a trap with fellow Germans, okay, with his tribe as well as other tribes, and formed this alliance that they were going to be ready in the forest when he led the legions through the forest. And so these legions are just marching through the forest like it's regular any day in Germany, roughly 15,000 men between these 3 legions, and then all of a sudden, in the middle of the forest, when they're stretched out along this giant road, okay, this long road, for miles, all of a sudden tons and tons of German forces, German tribesmen, and barbarians, kind of looking like these, jump out of the forest, out of the woods, and start attacking from both sides, and killing the Romans like this, and attacking the Romans here, and stuff like this. So tons of Germans attack during this period of time, and it's not even just one day. It's according to some sources that it's several days. Well, it basically becomes a massacre. And almost all 15,000 men from these 17th, 18th, and 19th legions are completely killed and destroyed. All 15,000 men, all 3 legions completely killed. Varus, Quintilius Varus, realizing when he's about to die, writes a quick letter telling Augustus what happened, and basically kills himself with having one of his swords, stabbed through his own stomach because he doesn't want to be killed by the Germans. He felt that it was an honor issue. He could have escaped maybe on a horse, possibly. The messenger does make it all the way to Rome, telling Augustus what happened about this massacre. It is also known as the Varian disaster because of Varus, okay? Named after Varus, the Varian disaster. And the eagles. The eagles are of the legions, which are these big giant gold eagles, which are kind of on the tops of their flags. But instead of having a flag, it's just this eagle. And this eagle is about 2 feet wide, okay? If not 3 feet wide in some cases. And it's made of gold. It's maybe probably plated gold in some cases, but sometimes maybe solid gold, depending on the year of the eagle, when it was created. But these giant gold eagles are pretty dang heavy, and they were kind of the flag of the legion, okay? They had like a number on here, and then usually a small flag underneath saying what legion number they were as well. But the 3 eagles are never recovered, and that's kind of a major point of pride. It's kind of like when the flag is destroyed or something like that, and people get upset about the flag being destroyed. It's very similar to that, okay? And so the 3 eagles are never recovered for the 17th, 18th, and 19th legions. And when Augustus finds out about this Battle of Teutoburg Wald happening, he kind of screams out, "Where are my legions?" And he, for weeks, if not more, months, almost years afterwards, he would wake up in the middle of the night kind of having nightmares, Augustus, about losing these 3 men and losing the pride of these legions, the eagles. And so there was constantly this kind of comment made that he would yell, "Publius Quintilius Varus, where are my eagles?" Okay, really meaning where are my, where are my men and where are my legions and where's, our pride. And so that was a major disaster, and it's one of the really biggest disasters that happens to Rome in a very long time before and after this, military-wise, because just 3 legions just completely wiped out. Immediately after this, Augustus starts making some military reforms, okay, and starts making some social reforms with this, because he realized when he lost his men in Teutoburg, up here in Germany, that it's time to stop expanding the empire. Okay, and so what he decides to do is he limits the expansion of the empire. And only expanded it to natural borders, and so he expands it to this natural border of the Danube River, and we're going to show a picture of that in the next slide as well. But there's a river right along here that flows into the Black Sea, almost from the middle of Germany, called the Danube. Okay, and then the Rhine is this river right here. Okay, the Rhine River. Remember, Julius Caesar crossed it. Well, Augustus had kind of crossed it during this Publius Varus expedition, and then because they lost men, he tells his men, okay, from now on, don't cross the Rhine. That is where the border is going to be. And there's this little stretch of a couple 100 miles between the two where the tips of the rivers don't meet, and so they kind of decide, okay, well, that's where we're going to have another border here. And then the other borders, well, the desert, right, of the Saharan desert, and then Egypt, and then there's a little bit of the rivers here for the Tigris and Euphrates, or the Euphrates River here for Syria. And for the most part, he also extends into Spain here, but there's nothing else. That's water, right? And so kind of he expands it in these blue areas because he took over Egypt beforehand from Mark Antony and Cleopatra. So now he kind of expands this area, and then he kind of says, this is how far as we're going. And we're going to now, instead of expanding past these, we're going to just secure the borders and fortify the borders with a bunch of little forts and putting our legions and soldiers along the borders so that other people can't invade us. And so he creates a defensive foreign policy and also uses the natural borders such as the rivers, such as the Rhine and Danube, as well as the water itself and the desert and stuff. And so no longer invading new territory, and they would only fight to secure borders. And so, as you can see, all the legions right here, 3 of them are gone here. They're faded. They're not the right numbers, but on this picture, but they were. And so he's got all the legions spread out. One over in Africa, another one in Egypt to protect it, several over here because of possibly Parthia invading, as well as revolts in Syria, which we'll talk about later in this lecture. And then he's also got a bunch here along the Danube River. You can kind of see the Danube River is along this border, this blue little line here. And then he's got the Rhine River, a bunch of them up there because of the problem that just happened. And so he also realizes that because the Roman Empire is going to be expanding anymore, that there's so many legions in the empire, and he wants to ensure loyalty of them, he cuts the number of legions down from 60 legions all the way to 28. And these are the positions of the 28 legions. And then he kind of loses the 3 of them, and they start rebuilding those 3 eventually. But he establishes a permanent navy as another military reform, where they're finally going to have a navy always. And that's also because of, the Battle of Actium and everything, and also fighting against Sextus Pompey. He realizes a navy is really needed, and that they shouldn't just have to build a navy anytime there's a problem with the navy, or an enemy that uses their navy, but they should always just have a Roman navy just in case. And so he establishes a permanent navy. Marcus Agrippa basically takes over for that for a long time, until his death. He made sure to pay the troops and their money himself. He actually does it, Augustus. He makes sure to actually go to the Senate every single time, but the Senate at this point is kind of losing power, every year under him. And he makes sure that the land for retirement is also picked out by him. He gets to decide these soldiers', retirement funds. And he is responsible for it, no longer the legion commanders. And because of this, the military starts swearing allegiance to the emperor. The emperor himself, as in Augustus, as well as later emperors, okay? Not the empire. They become loyal to the man, not the nation, okay? And that's a major thing. And so, let's wrap up this video. right here, and we'll show you this picture of basically some of the client kingdoms that are right near near it, as opposed to all of the green and yellow areas, which is Rome itself. Okay, and so those are kind of the borders. And again, here's the Danube River kind of extending through here, right through there. Okay, so that's basically the Roman Empire as the extent of Augustus's thing as reign, and we're going to pick up with this slide on the next video.